Alrighty, guys. So just looking at my clock, I want to be cognizant of time. It is 3 p.m. So first off, I want to thank you all for coming, for being part of our Admitted Students Week, and congratulations on being accepted to Assumption University. That is very exciting. Today, you're in a mock English class. So I'm joined today by Professor David Thoreen. So I'm going to introduce him in a second. But before I do, I'm just going to go over some housekeeping items with all of you. So today's class will run about 30 to 40 minutes or so. And at the end of it, we will have a Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, I definitely encourage you to post those in the chat or kind of write them down throughout the class today so you can make sure to ask those. I should also let all of you know that we are recording today's session. So if you want to rewatch it in the future, or maybe you know someone that couldn't attend today, that will be available after the class today. So we can always send that over to you. If you are having any technical difficulties, just message me in the chat. I'm more than happy to kind of help work through those with you to the best of my ability. But I also mentioned that this will be recorded. So if you're having troubles, we can always send it to you. And lastly, we are going to be joined by a current student by the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions about what it's like to be a student at Assumption, you can definitely ask our student Christian when he gets here, those types of questions as well. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to pass it over to David Thoreen. He is a faculty member in our English department, and he's going to walk you through this mock class today. So David?
Hey, everybody. I hope you can see me okay. And if you can turn your cameras on, that would be great for me because I like to be able to see people's faces. What I'm hoping is in a few minutes, I'm going to be able to get you all to talk a little bit. I know that's a scary concept. You're just meeting each other and me. But I think there's kind of a few simple goals for today's session. As I see them, one of them, if I'm thinking about this from your perspective, one of your goals is to meet some people. Another one is meet a professor, talk about language. Presumably you're attending an English class because something about you likes the way words work, or you see yourself as a kind of literary person, maybe among other abilities and interests you have. And I'm hoping also that one of your goals is to laugh a little, because that's usually how class should work. And so I hope I can have you do that. And then the kind of big cognitive thing we're going to try to do is practice something I'm sure you've heard, which is the skill of close reading. And, by close reading, what I mean is a way of interpreting written texts by focusing on the language in those texts in order to try to understand meanings at a deeper level. So that's really what I'm going to have us do. And again, I'm going to try to keep my eye on the time as well. So wish me luck. And I'm happy to have you guys turn your cameras on. If it's comfortable for you to stay muted for now, that's fine. At some point, please unmute, and so that you can kind of engage in the conversation. I'll tell you a little bit about how I usually use this exercise. I teach lots of different courses in the English department at Assumption, ranging from English composition to creative writing to upper level courses in 20th century American literature to senior seminars. So I kind of teach all kinds of different stuff, but this exercise I often use on the first day of class. It would be part of what I do to kind of introduce students to the course. And I think of it as an interesting activity involving a piece of writing from a writer I'm pretty confident most of you will be familiar with. So I want to start by sharing my screen here, and I'm going to, I'm just going to bring up here this PowerPoint. It's got, don't be alarmed by the kind of fancy sounding title I've got here, but the title sounds very academic, but I think I'm going to ground it for you in a second. But it's titled World War II Propaganda, Democracy, and S.I. Hayakawa's Ladder of Abstraction. That's the first part of the title. And then here's the writer that I think you will recognize, if not by name. You know a few works by this person, I think. How E.B. White used concrete details to reinvigorate an empty signifier. And what I mean by an empty signifier is a big abstraction, a big word that can mean so many different things to different people that unless we define it carefully, it winds up meaning anything to anyone, which is to say it means nothing. And so if it means nothing, or it means, whatever the reader wants it to mean, I would call it an empty signifier. It's another term from critical, from linguistics, really. So let me try flashing ahead. It doesn't, oh, let's try this. Maybe this will do. All right, great. So here's the text I want to read with you first. This is the whole thing, okay? And we're going to come back and break this up, but I'll read through it with you first. And I just want you to have in mind that it comes out in the middle of World War II. December 7th, the date that will live in infamy, 1941, is Pearl Harbor, right? So about a year and a half later, published in the New Yorker is this short little essay by E.B. White. I'll read it so it's in your head, and then we'll kind of take care of some background and then come back to it and examine it more closely. So it appeared under the title, "What is Democracy?" We received a letter from the Writers' War Board the other day asking for a statement on the meaning of democracy. It presumably is our duty to comply with such a request, and it is certainly our pleasure. Surely the board knows what democracy is. It is the line that forms on the right. It is the don't and don't shove. It is the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. It is the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It is an idea that hasn't been disproved yet, a song the words of which have not gone bad. It's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the rationed coffee. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of a morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is. All right, so you don't need to worry about all the details yet. We're going to go down, we're going to come back and go through some of those slowly. These are the two texts that I think you all know, this writer from E.B. White, right? Hopefully you've had the chance to read at least one, and even better, both. But if the name itself didn't ring a bell, I thought these book covers would. So here's what I'm going to do is give you just a little bit of background. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk kind of fast at the beginning so we can get to your contributions to this conversation. So I'm going to give you a little bit of historical background here about, what was going on before 1943, before this essay appears in the New Yorker. And that story really kind of begins with World War I and the United States' use of propaganda during the war. And then it jumps ahead to the ways that some of the fascist regimes in Europe during the 1930s were using propaganda. So I'm relying on a historian named Thomas Howell here. I'm just going to read this with you quickly. In the Writers' War Board, U.S. Domestic Propaganda During World War II, historian Thomas Howell explains that public reaction to U.S. government propaganda during World War I, coupled with criticism of the propaganda methods of European dictatorships in the 1930s, meant that new strategies were needed to build and sustain support for the United States war effort during World War II. According to Howell, the government determined to de-emphasize propaganda and to adopt instead a strategy of truth, that is, to disseminate information to the public while refraining from attempts to persuade directly. Public support was considered so vital, however, that means were found to circumvent the government's official position. One such approach was the little-known Writers' War Board, established to promote government policy and popular support for the war, while the government itself technically refrained from propaganda. So I kind of want to have you imagine now, if you're E.B. White and the Writers' War Board writes to you, and you're kind of in a position of, all right, well, I'd like to support the war effort, but I don't want to engage in simple propaganda. And I don't want to do anything or write anything that might make me feel guilty or uneasy or queasy down the line. The other thing I have to have you know about, just in terms of historical context here, is about a semanticist named S.I. Hayakawa, who would later become a U.S. senator, served one term. But in 1939, so a few years before White's essay appears in the New Yorker, he published a book called Language and Action. And later he's going to revise this book a number of times. I think it made it into like its 10th edition. So it lasts for about 50 years. It kind of gets repeatedly revised. But he came up with this idea of the ladder of abstraction. And what I want you to know is effective speakers and writers have always kind of used what he called ladder of abstraction, but he gave it a name. And that makes it a little easier for us to think about and talk about these moves, which one way to think about it is it's a move up or down the ladder from the concrete toward the abstract, or moving down the ladder from the abstract toward the concrete. I'm going to give you his little image in a second here that'll kind of ground this for you. So as we climb the ladder of abstraction, we move from concrete particulars down here. So I'm going to think of one cow on my farm named Bessie, who's got kind of mottled markings, especially on her left flank. It's particularly coffee colored or something, right? And then if I move up the ladder of abstraction, I move away from that individual animal to just any cow, right, which shares certain characteristics and so on. Move up the ladder of abstraction one step further, and I get to a broader category, which is called livestock, right? If I move up the ladder of abstraction from there, I arrive at farm assets, which would include my fields, my tractors, other equipment, and so forth. If I move up the ladder of abstraction from there, I move away from just farm assets, and maybe I start thinking about stocks and bonds, or the apartment buildings I own in, rural New York or whatever, and just think about an asset in general rather than the limited farm assets. And then I can abstract even further and arrive at this, big abstraction, wealth, right? So Bessie is a concrete, particularized form of wealth, way down on the abstraction ladder. Okay, hang in with me. We're going to return shortly to E.B. White's little essay. But what I want you to have you bear in mind here is that when Hayakawa came up with that ladder of abstraction, he's not advocating, but just describing the way language works. So abstractions are higher on the ladder, but that doesn't necessarily make them superior in value. In other words, our goal as writers or thinkers isn't to remain on the higher rungs of the ladder necessarily, though for some things like public policy, let's say public health policy, we can imagine that if we were going to come up with rules for who should be vaccinated first or something during the current pandemic, we would want to probably be largely operating on the higher rungs of the ladder. We don't want to be talking about my Aunt Martha who lives in Minnesota. We want to be talking about, people over 65 or people with particular health risks or something. Here's the important part, and it's going to tie back to our friend E.B. White. Propaganda, advertising, lies, and other deceptions usually work best on the higher levels of abstraction. And that means that thoughtful citizens need to be wary of arguments presented only in abstract terms. So I'll give you a couple examples. Imagine my saying to you, democracy is superior to socialism, or capitalism is the most efficient economic system. Well, maybe both those are true, but until I can ground what I mean with concrete details, you should feel free to resist or be slow to accept those propositions, right? These big abstractions can quickly become empty signifiers, carrying no real meaning other than those we've been conditioned by our culture to accept. When this happens, democracy means that which we approve of, while socialism is its opposite, right? It doesn't have anything to do with what we actually mean by capitalism, or democracy. We just know that, we're supposed to approve of that. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything particular about socialism other than, that's a negative. I've been kind of trained by my culture to hold that at arm's length. So one more little step, and then we'll get back to our friend E.B. White. Most effective arguments move up and down the ladder of abstraction. So let me have you think about this one. I'm just struggling to move this out of my way. So this is true. During World War II, some American writers were debating the meaning of good bombing versus bad bombing. And these arguments, I'm sure, unfolded on the abstraction ladder's upper rungs, where readers wouldn't have to consider the equivalent of Bessie as individual people who might be harmed in this good or bad bombing, or even cows, people in general. Today, my little typo here, today we hear euphemisms like collateral damage. That's a term maybe familiar to you. That's an abstraction that erases the images that might prompt citizens to object to it, right? Collateral damage means, oh, people that were killed accidentally. Well, you know, collateral damage as a kind of euphonious sounding word with no images makes us not think of the people whose families have been harmed by that, the people who've been killed, the mothers and fathers without children, or the children without parents, and so on. E.B. White wanted to avoid writing propaganda, and he realized he could best say something meaningful about the big abstraction democracy by remaining almost entirely on the level of concrete particulars. And so this is going to return us to his little essay here. Before we look at them, let's think about a couple other cultural references that in 1943, he could safely assume all his New Yorker readers would understand. First one, and I know from having taught this to students in the past, these are likely to give you guys a little bit of trouble. So I want to take the time to kind of build your confidence and give you some background here. And then when we get to the phrases in the context of the essay, you'll say, all right, I know where I am. I know what's going on. So three of White's references, I would say, are particularly vexing for college students now in the 21st century. First one, what's a stuffed shirt? And what's with that sawdust that he talks about? What's a high hat? And what's with the dent in it? And then finally, with his phrase, the recurrent suspicion that more than half of the people are right more than half of the time, White was riffing on a phrase that nearly every reader of the New Yorker in 1943 would have recognized immediately. And maybe it's the case that all you guys recognize it immediately as well. But I'm going to just prompt the question for now and ask, what was the phrase and where did it come from? So let's take a look at stuffed shirt first. And maybe you know this term, the OED is short for the Oxford English Dictionary. It's kind of the biggest and best dictionary in the English language. And so you can, for instance, access it online from the Assumption Library. And one of the things that's great about it is not only just the definitions, but it gives you historical uses of words and phrases. So according to the OED, a stuffed shirt is, quote, one who is pompous and conservative, but usually ineffectual. And then I just added this little quip, you know, more importantly, look at the image of this guy over here is the stuffed shirt. And it made me think also of the word puffed up. And so I looked that up in the OED, and that's kind of helpful here. That gives you the definition of inflated or swollen with vanity, pride, etc., having an inflated sense of one's importance or worth, pompous, overweening, frequently used now chiefly with up, puffed up. So remember that E.B. White refers in his essay to the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. And so I just want to have you look at that image and think, what if instead of that puffed shirt being stuffed with flesh, with this big, you know, man, it's actually fake. It's literally stuffed with sawdust, something of no value. And there's a little hole in it, in that shirt. And as we watch, the stuffing, the thing that made that man look so impressive, is slowly trickling out in an unending process that, you know, reduces him to size, right? That's kind of part of the idea that White is getting at. And somehow we're gonna have to talk together. What does that tell us about democracy? The hole through which the sawdust slowly trickles. What does that tell us about democracy? So that's where things are gonna get a little gnarly for us in a minute. You gave me the high hat, complains a character in the Coen brothers film Miller's Crossing. The man means he's been treated as a social inferior, and he's not very happy about that. I'm hoping you guys have all seen the movie Groundhog Day. If you have, you've seen men with high hats. They look kind of like this. And remember that E.B. White will refer to the dent in the high hat. So that's a thing we're going to have to try to figure out. Well, what is the dent in the high hat? And I'm just going to say here, it might help to ask, why would a man wear a top hat when he could wear a cap? Right? So imagine a kind of, you know, Irish working man's cap. Why are these guys holding up the groundhog so delightedly. Why are they all wearing these high hats, these top hats? What's that supposed to signify? Last one here comes from Abe Lincoln. Lincoln said, "You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time." And here, so E.B. White alludes to the optimism of Lincoln, and he was somebody who never lost faith in the common people. All right, so have you guys got your phones handy? You don't go anywhere without your phone, right? I just need to, I'm going to switch here, but I think it's going to be easiest. I'm going to try stop sharing here for a second. I'm going to show you this document instead. I'll show it to you in just a second here. If you have your phone handy, I'd like you to take a picture of this. Here we go. So take a shot of this document right here, so that you can see all 15. What I did is I just broke up the essay, and it might be useful for you to be able to refer to that in a few minutes. My slides are going to kind of break that up. So everybody all set there? Everybody's got a picture of that? Great. Thanks, Caitlin. The thumbs up is encouraging to me. All right. All right. So now let me stop sharing that. Go back to my other screen. Let's see here. Go back to this. Okay. Great. All right, so now I'm just flash through here. Boom, boom, boom. I just want to have you take another look with me at E.B. White's essay. And it's so weird to call this one paragraph an essay, but it really is, as we start looking at all the ideas it contains. So here's how it begins. We received this letter, and he's talking about kind of the royal we. It means I got this letter from the Writers' War Board asking for a statement on the meaning of democracy. I'm happy to comply, blah, blah, blah. I always think of Linus here, when Linus says, well, everybody knows what Christmas is all about, Charlie Brown, right? And he says, here's E.B. White, surely the board knows what democracy is. And then he starts giving us these definitions. And so let's take a look at them one at a time. And here's where I'm going to ask you guys to unmute and join the conversation. And we're going to sort of spin our wheels a little, maybe. I'm going to let in Christian. It's the line that forms on the right. So somehow democracy is the line that forms on the right. And I'm curious now, I think he's just talking about people lining up, right? And so I want us to think about that. How is it that when a line forms, how does it take shape when you get into line? So get in line, where in the line do you go? How does that process work? I think we need to figure out that. And then we need to figure out, why is it important that it forms on the right? And I'm gonna make your lives easier, I think, by saying, let's imagine that we've all just attended a high school basketball game, and imagine that there's no pandemic and there are high school basketball games, and it was really fun and crowded, and actually the home team won and we were the home team, so that was extra fun. And now we're going to go out and get pizza with our friends. And there were about, let's say, 600 people in that gymnasium, and the line forms on the right. So if I can get people to unmute and talk about this for just a minute, that would be great.
I was just gonna say that like the line is formed, but it's kind of one-sided.
Okay, can you say more about what you mean, Caitlin, about, could you say a little more about like how it forms? Like, how do you know where to stand in line?
Through the kind of just following other people.
Okay, so what would you say to me if I said, well, I've never been much of a follower, and so I'm going to follow you up till where you get in line, but then I'm going to walk up to the front of the line.
Then there's the outliers who go up to the front and start it.
That's not how the line's supposed to form, right? When E.B. White says it's the line that forms on the right, he's talking about what you're talking about, is people, they enter the line in the order in which they arrive there, right? And they don't do what I was talking about. They don't, go up to the front or sneak a few spaces even. And remember, we're using this example of the gymnasium after the basketball game. So our interest, and I'm thinking about this as a kind of little metaphor for political interest, our interest now that the game is over is in leaving the gymnasium as quickly as possible and getting the pizza place as quickly as possible, right? So why shouldn't we just mob all the doors and go flooding out? Why, if we did, according to E.B. White's little definition here, that wouldn't be democratic. Because when he says it's the line that forms on the right, so now I'm imagining each doorway would have a line that forms on the right. Why should we only use half the doorway in pure democratic fashion? That's kind of a question for everybody. And I'm going to just kind of flash through here, and people are being polite and shy, and
Maybe because it just goes both ways.
Yeah. So isn't that the idea that if we're only on the right, then we can leave, and then somebody, for whatever strange reason, let's say they want to come in and have a pickup game of basketball while the lights are still on, they can enter and try to do what they're interested in without us getting in each other's way.
Yeah.
And so that's part of, so that means everybody can pursue their own interests without interference. And so that means it's, fair and equitable for everyone. And, again, you arrive in line, and they don't say, oh, the people with the nicest shoes get to go to the front of the line, or the people who made the most money last year get to go to the front of the line. No, you enter, you join the line according to when you arrived in it. And the people who got there early then are in front, and everybody acknowledges that, right? It's like buying concert tickets back in the old days when we didn't buy them just all online. So that's really the kind of the first one there. I want to back up here. The second one, let's try, it is the don't and don't shove. And I know we're going to run out of time here, but I hope we can get to at least one more after this one. It is the don't and don't shove. So why do people think that really the way to ask this is, what does that tell us about democracy? Such a weird little sentence, the don't and don't shove. And I guess we have to really think about the verb shove. What does that, we all know what it means. We've all been shoved. If we have younger siblings, we've probably done our share of shoving ourselves. But can we think about it kind of metaphorically? Like, what does it mean to shove someone? What is it we're really using or doing? And if this were a real class, I should hasten to tell you guys, I hope you recognize there's nothing malevolent about my approach or attitude in class. It's purely about having fun and keeping people engaged. But I would probably randomly call on people just to, get more voices in the room. But I won't do that today because, so I guess what I'm saying, Caitlin, is if you have interest in trying to answer, like, what are your associations with the word shove? That might be helpful.
It's kind of putting democracy in a place of, it has power, or at least a placeholder where you shouldn't and not to push it.
Good. Yeah. Can you tell us about the word push, shove? You even use the word power.
Yeah.
What are we kind of really talking about? And what he's saying explicitly is democracy doesn't do that. It doesn't rely on this thing. It doesn't rely on pushing, shoving, on power, because it's the don't and don't shove, right?
Yeah.
Can you think of another word that comes to mind? If you've taken a physics class, maybe this word is all over your physics homework. We talk about,
I don't know.
Forces or force.
Yeah.
So one way to think about shove, right, is a great word for describing physical force. And so when he says it's the don't and don't shove, he's saying democracy isn't about using physical force, right? Rather, it's about some other means of persuasion, presumably reason and evidence. We saw a few weeks ago there in January some efforts to use force to get what they, for people to get what they wanted, and happily it did not work. We still live in a democracy where people were hurt, even killed, but the people who used force did not achieve their objectives. The third thing, let's try this. Well, we talked a little bit about the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. Maybe you can kind of figure that one out on your own based on all the images, but let's do quickly the dent in the high hat. And we think about that kind of top hat that we frequently see images of Abe Lincoln himself wearing. If I show up to class and I've got my, top hat, which shows my elevated social position, but there's a dent in the high hat, which is visible to everyone. All you got to do is look at me and you go, all right, well, he's, clearly of the upper class, but I guess he's not quite uppermost class because he got a dent in his hat and he can't afford to throw that one away and get a new one. And so what E.B. White's giving us a little bit there is democracy somehow takes the economic clout away from, or even mocks a little bit, the rich among us. So it's not simply a government to be manipulated for the uses and ends of the rich. I think that's part of what he's getting at there. I'm just keeping my eye on the time here. We get a little more time. I want to go to the next slide.
Mhm.
I'll skip Lincoln's, this phrase that connects to Lincoln. And what I'd especially like to be able to do would be talk with you about 9 and 10. I'm going to change my comma after 9 there, but the others I think are a little more clear. Maybe 7 maybe is a little tricky. The idea of communion in the libraries, it's almost a word of community, and why the library should sponsor that feeling is something we could talk about. But I want to look at democracy as a letter to the editor and have us kind of think about, and you guys as English students who've come to an English class probably have ideas about what a letter to the editor is or does. And then with the 10th one, I always joke with students about, well, I see the word score and ninth, and it makes me think about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And I know if you're into music, they talk about music scores. It's all the notes written on those funny looking bars that run across a sheet of music, right? And I kind of basically I massively misread that line, right? The line about the score at the beginning of the ninth is not about Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It's not about music. But sometimes it's easy when we read a poem, and I kind of think that this little essay by E.B. White needs to be read as a poem. Sometimes we out of desperation, will grab a bit of language and misread it, and then it kind of makes our lives impossible. But so that's a misreading. I don't think we're meant to think that way, but I'm hoping someone can correct us there. But let's start with democracy as a letter to the editor, and then talk about that score at the beginning of the ninth for a minute, and then we can bring in Christian, and hopefully you'll have some questions for him. Anybody want to offer up an idea, unmute themselves and go out on a limb and say, well, here's what I think a letter to the editor is. And you probably also are familiar with the term editorial. So we need to be able to distinguish between the two. So anybody on that?
I had some, sorry for joining late. I just had a quick class that ended late, but yeah, I found this very interesting. But for sure, like democracy letter to the editor. I never really heard this this poem from E.B. White, but I was sort of thinking that I think when I think of democracy, I think is like society as a whole, and that letter is what our voices are to those in higher power, to like which is I see is like known as the editor in this sort of case. So I find it very interesting. I don't know. It's like hard to explain, but
can we say just a little more about could we try to define what is a letter to the editor exactly?
Oh, sorry, you can go.
No, you can go if you want.
All right, let's see. Okay, so a letter to an editor, like in literal sense, I guess you can say, is why someone wrote something, and then why they said what they said, and like in the sense of like sort of like a sort of maybe like a set of critiques.
Okay, it often is a critique, yeah. Caitlin, can I get you to chime in there on that? What is
I
a
was gonna-
letter to the editor?
I was gonna say, like, for number 9, that it's like a group as a whole, society, coming together, kind of composing an idea or a critique, and then kind of pushing it off to a higher power
Okay.
for approval.
Yeah. So let's imagine you're the higher power for a minute. Let's say you're the editor of the New York Times, right? Or the Wall Street Journal, depending on your politics. All right. So let's say you're the editor of the Wall Street Journal, and Christian and I say, you know what, we got this issue that's been bothering us for a while. We'd like to get some people to pay attention to it. So we're going to craft together this letter to the editor. And we're a couple of nobodies. Nobody's really heard of us, but we're really interested in an idea and we're passionate about it. So we write this letter together and we send it off to you, the editor of the Wall Street Journal, and you publish it. And now every subscriber to your newspaper across the United States has access to our ideas. And what did we do in order to get that kind of public attention? Did we each make, $200 million? And did we take out a big expensive advertisement in your newspaper? No, we did not. We wrote something that was logical, that was timely, that made sense to people. And then as an editor, you made our voices available to all of your readers. And so here's E.B. White saying, democracy is a letter to the editor. It's a way that anybody from any part of our society can have their opinions heard without previously being rich and powerful, or necessarily having friends who are rich and powerful or own or edit newspapers. They can send in that letter and it might be chosen to be published and then read by all the readers. And that's a pretty nifty thing. We don't imagine that happens in a totalitarian regime, in a more in a fascist government. They're not just going to publish the ideas of people who simply express them well. So then let's go to this last one and we'll turn things over to your questions. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. And when we're working on this is an essay, but when we work, it's like a poem, So I often say when you're working on a poem, a good idea is to kind of pretend that you're from Mars. And what I like about that is it frees you up to be dumb. And what I mean by that is if I'm supposed to say something smart, that's really hard. But if I can kind of admit to myself, well, I don't really know what's going on here, and I can try to, come to it with new eyes, with fresh eyes. So I'm going to pretend that I don't really understand baseball. And, that's not a reference to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, right? It's a reference to baseball. And one of the ways I know that is because a couple of lines later, he's going to refer to the mustard on the hot dog. And I kind of that makes me think about baseball too. But what happens, let's see if we could, as a class, define the ninth inning of a baseball game. And what I mean by that is I want us to kind of quickly understand what exactly comprises or constitutes the ninth inning. And then we can work from there backwards to say, how is whatever the score is at the beginning of that inning like democracy? So and please, anybody who's on the call, join Christian and Caitlin, who've done such a good job to sustain this conversation. Throw out some ideas there about the beginning of the ninth. And maybe I'll just stop sharing here and people can actually see each other or see each other's photos that are up, but it's the score at the beginning of the ninth. So what happens in a ninth inning?
The end.
The end, that's true. But so remember, I'm from Mars, so I'm greedy for details. I want you to tell me in as close a detail, as fine a detail as possible, what exactly happens during the ninth inning. No matter what the score is, right? Well, that's not quite fair.
Someone wins.
But yeah, go ahead, Caitlin.
Someone wins, or it's
that wins. That's true. Somebody's going to win. We know that no baseball game can end in a tie. What actually happens during the ninth inning? So here we're at the beginning of the ninth, Christian.
Yep.
What's going to happen?
So I mean, there's a lot of sort of, I guess if it is a tight game, it'd be a lot of nervous type vibes going on, because it's the last, it's like literally it's like the last part of the game, unless it's like you said, it's a tie.
Yeah.
Where both teams will go up at bat to see if they can basically score any more runs in at the end.
Okay, now remember I'm from Mars, so I just want you to explain really carefully. So will both teams bat at the same time?
No.
No, okay. So this is the kind of
So-
thing about what I mean when I say, like, I'm going to pretend I'm
Yeah.
dumb just so I can get it really clear
Okay.
in my head.
So one team will be pitching the ball while the
Yep.
other one will be hitting. And if the team that's hitting, if their ball gets caught by the other team that is pitching, or they catch it at base, it's considered a strike. Therefore, you have 3 strikes, and then after the third strike will be that will be the time where the teams will switch, and
So
the other team.
each team gets 3 strikes.
Yes.
I'm joking. I'm kind of joking
Yeah.
with you guys, but you guys know that's not quite right, right?
Yeah.
3 strikes is an out. Isn't that how it goes?
Yes.
And each, but really what happens, each team gets 3.
Not players, but like, I don't know.
See, it gets hard, it gets difficult, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things we're getting at is each team is going to have opportunities to score until the other team in the field on defense has made 3 outs against them, right?
Yes.
But again, it's this question of this matter of equality. So both teams have equal opportunity in the 9th inning to score as many runs as possible, and with any luck, they'll win. But the point is, the game isn't over until it's over, and each team has that equal opportunity to win. And it's not based on you each have 5 minutes or each have 10 minutes. The game will go on as long as possible, as long as your team continues to score. So it's kind of interesting, like why he didn't choose, a basketball game or, the final 2 minutes of a hockey game or something. Baseball, there's no real time limit. It's all about opportunity and your ability to take advantage of it. As long as your team is taking advantage of it, you can keep on running up the score. Okay, so there's a few others that we didn't get to. Some of them I think you can figure out on your own if you just kind of treat it like a game and say, all right, what's Stevie White saying here about democracy? But I want to stop at this point and turn things over to the chat. And here's Allison again, and Christian can chime in and answer questions that he knows about, all kinds of things I don't know about. I kind of know about the classroom and requirements and that sort of stuff, and that's only in a way a small fraction of your life as a college student. So
Definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. I definitely like that baseball conversation. It's definitely harder than it looks. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you definitely learned something and that you enjoyed the activities that we did. I am going to introduce Christian. So he is a current student. So I'm going to give him just a moment to kind of let you all know what his major is, the different things he's involved in on campus, get to know him a little bit. And then we're open to questions and answers. They can either be, directed to Christian about what it's like to be a current student, or directed to professors, so you can kind of learn more about the English program here at Assumption. So Christian, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Allison. So my name is Christian. I am a current sophomore. I live in Hanover, Massachusetts, the South Shore area. I am a cybersecurity major with a criminology minor. Besides being an admission ambassador, I work at IT, and I will be the future president of the cybersecurity club. So obviously I'm not an English major, but I did take a few English classes for sure. So if you have any questions about like res life or sort of like being a freshman on campus, because I'm one of the most, like, I guess besides not being a freshman, I'm like one of the youngest in the admission ambassador team. So I can maybe help answer any questions like prior to entering campus, like maybe dorms or anything like that. So just let me know. You unmute yourself, or obviously in the chat's fine.
Great. Thanks, Christian. So if you guys want to utilize the chat, if you're more comfortable, I know Trinity, you did use the chat earlier. So if you're more comfortable using the chat, that is totally fine. I'm more than happy to read those off so we can get those questions answered. You know, this is a great opportunity where you have a one-on-one with a professor and a one-on-one with a current student. So definitely take advantage of this time to ask any questions that come to mind. So I'll let you guys you know, take some time thinking of those and either posting them or taking yourself off mute. And don't be shy, I promise, we don't bite. We're definitely here to help and to kind of let you know about anything that you're curious about. I wanna thank Caitlin for contributing today. I think I saw you last week. You're at the Education Showcase, right? I love your flag.
Yes.
I
Thank
love
you.
your flag. I love the school pride that you're displaying. So it's good to see you again. We're glad that you joined us for this session as well. Caitlin, what are you thinking of studying? Are you going to be an English major, education with an English major?
Yeah, so I would like to be an English high school teacher, so secondary education and then English, definitely.
Awesome. Not seeing any questions. Professor Thoreen, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave us with or anything else that you'd like to add?
I mean, I guess the last thing I would say is one of the delights of a little essay like the one we looked at by E.B. White is it kind of reminds us that language is often about play, and that we come up with the most insightful little interpretations when we try to just back away from what it seems to say explicitly and just kind of ask ourselves questions about it. That's one of the things I like about that baseball one too, is to really think about like, well, how is the score at the beginning of the ninth like democracy? That's kind of really hard. But then if I start looking and saying, well, what happens in the ninth inning of a baseball game? And then I start taking it apart, and then I start to see how the idea of opportunity becomes a metaphor for what democracy is, and that equality that's at the center of democracy is what that particular example tells us about. And, you know, the other thing I would just say is all of the little statements that E.B. White comes up with tell us something different about democracy. And that's, you know, he must have had great fun writing it, but it must have, you know, you admire his wit as he's come up with all these different scenarios or statements that all tell us something a little bit different about what democracy is. And just remember, he's only really operating almost at that Bessie or cow level of that ladder of abstraction. And yet, by the time we've worked through the whole little essay, we kind of know a lot about what democracy is all about, and maybe even have a new way of appreciating it. Really great to meet you guys. Hope to see you all in the fall. Caitlin, thanks, as Allison said, thanks for participating along with Christian and keeping things going for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Take care.
thanks guys. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.